And just to state, it's not us who are the impersonators. It's just we ran into a malware distribution campaign and decided to call the threat actors the impersonators because they had this tendency and desire to pretend to be, well, us. Actually, they like to hide behind their activities behind legit entities, most notably security software developers, most notably Sophos. So this is where it got personal for us. And it all started with a simple detection at one of our customers. It's our daily job to look into these incidents to see if there is anything deeper or interesting needs to be investigated. At first, it was just an average incident. We intercepted a command and control communication attempt originating from a shellcode that belongs to the Brute Ratel so-called red teaming educational tool. And it was executed from a library called healthapy.dll. And the only notable part in this was that this library had version information that belonged to a Sophos product. Now, there are several reasons why malicious activity can seem like originating from a legit Sophos component. It could be DLL side loading, process injection, or it could be just the threat actor use the fake version information when they build their binaries. We didn't have a file. At that point, we didn't even have a hash, so I couldn't conclude what's going on. And until a little while later, our colleagues at the MDR team found a sample at VirusTotal that matched the characteristics, the same Sophos version information and the same Brute Ratel activity, similar Brute Ratel activity. I'm not sure if it is exactly the same sample that we saw popping up in our user base, but it was similar enough for us to think that it could be coming from the same threat actor. So we started investigating it, and this is where I fell into a sizable rabbit hole. And several months later, I'm standing here and telling you our results that we found during this investigation. So looking at these binaries, we found several binaries that use the same characteristics. They had valid metadata and version info. Looking at the binary that was found by MDR team, we found that not only it had Sophos version information, correct Sophos version information, but a large part of the code was actually Sophos code, including debug information, source code information. So that was clearly our component that somehow ended up having malicious code inserted into it. Now, you understand where I'm going at this point. The possibilities that I listed before all went down the sink. And we were left with two possibilities at that point. The one is that the threat actor took a compiled binary from us and made a modification on that binary. The other option, that the modification was done on the source code level, which would mean that our build farms and development environments were compromised. And that's not a situation you would like to be. Some of you might remember 7 years ago, here at the Virus Bulletin, there was an excellent, honest, and detailed presentation by Avast researchers about the CCleaner case, where the piriform built environments were compromised by a threat actor. It was really a great presentation, but we'd rather not be in the situation to explain that. So at this point, the question is, how did the malicious code ended up in our binary? And with that, I hand it over to Steve, who would explain what the exact changes were.
So as Gabor mentioned, some of the change, they did the overwritten portion of the code. So that's why when we look at the export it looks like all confused. In this picture, we also see that, well, the certificate is all confused. Actually, now we see that the file is not even signed. In this picture, we see that like the P structure was mostly fixed up, but one thing we do notice is that extra P resource within the icon resource type. When we look at the DLL itself, that malicious Sophos DLL, we realize that the DLL register server function has been completely overwritten by the malicious code. And when we start to look at the code, we see that a string is being built up on the stack, which later we find that it's used for XOR decryption of that P resource that we just saw on the previous slide. This is the before and after of the same P resource. We see that on the bottom we get some shell code. It's hard to see in binary, but let's look at it in IDA. We get the Brute Ratel shellcode loader. Brute Ratel shellcode loader starts with a series of relative call to eventually get to RC4 decryption routine, which will decrypt the final payload to be injected into the running process. During our investigation, we found a lot of other malware that shared the same capabilities, and we were trying to see what was common into these malware resource. But for instance, the resource type, it's all over the place. So we couldn't really create any good detections based on resource type only. But we did find that the resource ID number is always an I number. So if they do add a resource, it will never start at number 1. This is another example. This is a Qakbot example. Similar thing, valid DLL, overwritten code to decode the malicious P resource. But in that case, the embedded executable is not encrypted, is in plain text. Well, plain text after the XOR decoding. That means if you're familiar with the P structure, there's a lot of zeros at the end. And you can use this information to basically brute force the XOR key. So you don't need to extract the key from the binary. You could create a script to automate payload extraction.
So what would be your verdict? Did the change happen at source code level or with the finished binary?
It's a binary. Every time, for all the samples we saw so far, well, in the DLL, in the Sophos DLL, it was overwritten at the DLL, one of the export, which was DLL register server. In some other instance, it was right at the DLL entry point or one of the export name. But every time it's one of at these places that the malicious code is there to decode the resource.
Thank you. It's a great relief. But let me assure you, if it turned out to be that it was compromised at Sophos, I would most likely be standing here in this podium and explaining that situation as well. I would be a much more uncomfortable situation. So it's easier to conclude that it was not that our systems are compromised by a threat actor. Having that, we could focus on understanding the infection chain. So we identified the payload that was Brute Ratel, or we will talk about later what other payloads were identified. From that, we could identify these modified, impersonated, legit binary components. From that, we could identify MSI installers that were installing these components. And from that, we could track back to JavaScript downloaders. And at that point, our trackback of the infection chain stopped. We didn't have enough information. Until at some point later, Unit 42 researchers from Palo Alto published information about the malware distribution campaign, where they find that contact forms from compromised sites were used to generate phishing emails that contained links. The links pointed to fake Azure websites. The fake Azure websites pointed to Firebase, Google Firebase URLs, where the JavaScript downloaders were hosted. So from then on, we already understood the infection process. So this is what completed our view of the entire process. And based on that information, we could allocate a couple of original emails that were sent out that initiated the infection, and they all contained a copyright infringement notice pointing to a document that should be read by the target that pointed through the redirections to the JavaScript code, which we already had, and we could identify that. This JavaScript downloader contained a lot of junk lines preceded with double slashes, plus a few lines preceded by 4 slashes, which contained the main body of the downloader, and a short loader code, which just found the lines with 4 slashes, extracted anything that comes after that, save it to a separate script, and execute that script. Overall, the script that was doing the main logic was, it's an interesting approach. I haven't seen that before. It was trying to find an available drive letter, and after that, it was mapping a remote UNC server location to that drive letter, and finally, it executed an MSI installer from that map drive, probably in an attempt to avoid security products to make sure that the MSI installer actually doesn't hit the local drive of the system. Later on, it was simplified when the threat actors figured out that there is this Windows installer, that installer ActiveX control that supports the execution of MSI installers from a remote location. Anyway, the hosting size, as we could find, some of them were open directories, and we find the version information. They use the WSGI DAV Python, simple Python web app server, so that they would have a server that provides the necessary services for the JavaScript downloader code to map it to a local drive. After that, the installer was very simple. It contained only one file, the impersonated DLL or executable with modified code inserted into it that loaded the payload. And it had a custom action to be executed during the installation. In this case, run DLL32 was used to load the library and execute the malicious export, the overwritten malicious export. So at this point, what we could see is that during the modification, the digital signature was compromised. Okay. It could still work. If anyone was investigating the processes, they could still see that it looks like a legit process, say Sophos process, because of the version information. But the threat actors thought that it is a good idea to resign some of the binaries. About 15% of the binaries were, after the modification, resigned again to be properly signed. But for that, they didn't use the original software vendors' libraries, which is a great relief. So those were not compromised. Instead, they were using some small businesses' certificates. In this case, Shantou Shanghai Rossheng Arts Company, which If you don't know about what this is, I don't know it either. It's a small company. The only reference that I find is a listing of care for wholesale partners. This is the small business somewhere in Asia. It doesn't have anything to do with software, so they don't have a code signing certificate. Going on further, all the files that we found on VirusTotal signed by these certificates were malicious ones. Looking at all the samples, we find a set of these signatures that were used by this threat actor. First few ones were registered at SSL.com, later on by digital sign, and no, global sign, sorry. The main characteristic of these certificates were they were registered in name of small businesses that have nothing to do with software development. They have registered for exactly 1 year, and all of the files that we found signed by this certificate were malicious. So it's not that this company's certificates were stolen, it's just someone registered a code signing certificate in their name. Does it ring a bell for anyone? Guys, you should pay more attention to the presentations here in this conference. Yesterday there was an interesting one by entity researchers about the P-wave of abused certificates. I suggest you read the paper. When they describe a black market that is providing exactly the same characteristic signatures. So I suspect that these impersonators were customers of that market. They were buying the certificates from there. So the impersonators have double meaning in that case. They impersonated the software vendors where they injected the code. They also impersonated these small businesses by using their abused signatures. So what was the payload that was distributed by that? So on this slide, you'll see a variety of the payload we saw. Actually, this capture was done months ago, so we found the other payload as well. And the chart shows the distribution of the payloads. We saw some Qakbot, Cobalt Strike most of the time, some Brute Ratel, Latrodectus. Latrodectus. So what I will go through only 3 of these payloads because we don't have time to go through all of them. Latrodectus was interesting because it's relatively new from this year and very similar to ICE-ID. So if we take that Unit 42 blog article that we saw earlier, the chain of infection, eventually we get a DLL in the process. If we look at that DLL, it looks legit, coming from a security vendor, but we do get this extra P resource as a bonus. When we de-XOR that resource, we see some shellcode at the beginning, and later down we see the embedded payload that is not encrypted for this particular sample. If we look at the shellcode, not the shellcode, but the embedded payload, this is actually a DLL dropper. So what it will do, will inject another DLL into the process, and will call its export function name scab. If we look at that next payload, this is our Latrodectus. And we can validate that the export name is Gab over there. Latrodectus open in IDA. When we start to look at it, we soon realize that strings obfuscation reuse the exact same algorithm as used by ICE-ID. And luckily for us, there was an IDA script already available done by TC Contrace that we just reuse like that. And it spits out all the, well, it's small a bit, but it spits out all the strings in plain text. Part of these strings you will find some of the config information, C2, campaign ID, things like that.
The next slide shows that CAPE is sandbox can extract the configs. So we do actually get the C2 information, group name, campaign ID, and other strings as well. From our samples, the group ID we saw are listed there. Next slide, Latrodectus. This is just to show that this is a basic backdoor malware. Some of the comments are there, and they actually map to another analysis that was done by Jason Reeves in the past. Now let's look at another payload, Oyster. Oyster is just a basic loader. Its main characteristic is the fact that the mutex name always contains the word Oyster. Another characteristic is that the PD path PDB path is always in the binary, and its name is cleanup.pdb. Good news again, CAPE sandbox can extract the config, so we're able to get the C2 information, DLL versions, and some of the strings that is used for the HTTP request. The last payload we're going to look at is SSLoad. Again, DLL seems to be legit from security vendor, an extra PE resource that decodes to DLL loader again. And when we extract that DLL, we find that it's SSLoad. SSLoad is written in Rust. I'm not sure if how many of you have seen the Rust presentation yesterday, but it's very difficult to reverse. But we did actually found the functions responsible for strings, the obfuscation. And when you do actually decrypt the string, you find the name of the malware and also C2 information.
Thank you. So, we could see that all of the payloads are typical initial access Trojans. If you had to guess, what would be your wildest guess? Who profits from distributing these initial access Trojans? What would be the purpose of this campaign? Yes, you are right, ransomware. That's a good guess. We found a couple of connections to ransomware groups within this impersonator campaign. One of the incidents that we investigated also loaded a Brute Ratel payload that was hosted on this website. According to Aristotle, several other files were hosted on that file. One of them, svhost.exe, turned out to be a black suit ransomware sample. So the files from the impersonator campaign and the ransomware file were hosted on the same site, which is, in my book, a strong connection with ransomware. Also, there were a couple of other impersonated carriers that loaded Cobalt Strike payload, and the C2 servers used by these two samples were reported by third-party publications as belonging to the Blackbuster ransomware group. So we found a couple of connections to ransomware groups, which is logical and fits the picture. When we climbed out of that deep rabbit hole, we found that 470 modified binaries were found. First sample last December, the freshest sample from this week. 27 vendors were impersonated this way. We found 7 compromised signatures. 77 of these 470 binaries were resigned by these abused signatures. We found 27 distribution servers and 59 C2 servers. And here's a list of some of the abused vendors. When we initially published our results, we contacted the vendors that we know at that time before the publication. And here I'm quoting the response from Bitdefender. I dare to quote it because they asked us to include that in our published report, and also because I totally understand and agree with their verdict. And the binaries were independently modified outside of the normal software functionality. The threat actors took the binary and on their own computers did the injection of the malicious code and the malicious resource. As far as they were concerned, as far as we were concerned, no other function, no further action was required. And if the product is properly installed on a system, this kind of modification is not possible to be done. And it's a correct response, and we totally agree with them. What can the software vendors do to prevent this kind of abuse? Really, nothing much. So the textbook response to what you should do if you want to avoid modification of your binary would be sign it digitally with a code signing certificate. Hey, the problem is that all of these files were initially signed by code signing certificates. But during the malicious code injection process, these digital signatures were compromised to the level that they were no longer recognized by the operating system. So after the modification was done, it was not reported that there is an invalid signature in the file, but that there is no signature in that file. So signing does not help. Tamper protection is great. It can prevent, if our product is active and running on the system, we can prevent this type of change. But guess what? The threat actors did not make the modifications with our product or any other products running on the systems. We can also make some clever additions to our components so that when it's executed, it checks if the binary is intact and no modification was made. But guess what? The malicious code is inserted at the entry point. So our self-check code has no chance of running. So all these, we can try the approach that our product recognizes if a binary looks like Sophos, say it has Sophos version information, but is not digitally signed, and it has suspicious entry point code. We do it. We can do it, and we do it, but we cannot do it for all the 27 or 30 affected vendors because we don't know their build process, and we don't want to take on the responsibility to false positioning on them because they use some irregular coding styles. So it's best bet to detect the payload as it is executed. So a couple of conclusions that I have at the end of this presentation. No, we still don't write and distribute viruses, despite what the impersonators wanted you to believe. And just because it looks and smells like it, it's not necessarily a legit Sophos program. Admittedly, it doesn't quack like a Sophos program because the malicious code is executed from them, but still. I should again emphasize that none of the affected software vendors were actually compromised. It's not their fault that these binaries that belong to them were modified. The fact is that security products are reputable. And because of that, criminals like to hide behind them and use this reputation to pretend and fool the users into safety. Attackers like to abuse this fact. This threat actor is still active. We still see samples coming from this campaign. I'm pretty sure that we can expect similar attacks in the future. In fact, we have identified another one. If looking from a very high-level point of view, it's exactly the same as the impersonators. So there is some threat actor that is taking binaries from legit software developers, modifies the entry point code to execute a loader, inserts encrypted resources, and loads the payload. So should be exactly the same scheme as with impersonators, but every detail is different. The loader code is different. Also, they are inserting other resources that host some sort of shellcodes. And the delivered payloads, even though they also qualify as initial access Trojans, asyncret or MCOS, this is a totally different set of payloads that is being distributed by these other campaigns. So at this point, I believe that this is another threat actor which just follows the same scheme of operation. And with my last breath, I'd like to emphasize that transparency and detailed disclosure helps to find not only this campaign, but everything in our industry. So Sophos is a strong supporter of industry cooperation like Cyber Threat Alliance. And whenever we can, we share our findings before publication with our connections within the industry, because we all have been on the other end, on the receiving end of this problem, that someone publishes a report that mentions our product. And from that on, we can expect a lot of media and user inquiries immediately falling upon us. So it's better to have an early notification when we have time to prepare for that and time to analyze properly the situation. So I encourage everyone to follow this practice. Thank you very much. And if I did my job right, there is no time for questions.